Some days begin quietly, almost gently. The air feels ordinary. Nothing in the morning suggests that anything unusual will happen. It seems like just another day, one that will pass like the many days before it. But sometimes a single moment arrives that changes the tone of everything. It began with something small, so small that most people would not even remember it by the evening. A word spoken with a sharp edge, a look that carried a hint of doubt, a gesture that felt colder than expected. At first, he ignored it. After all, small things happen every day. People misunderstand. Voices carry impatience. It is part of life. And so he continued quietly, believing the moment would pass like a cloud drifting across the sky. But that cloud did not drift away. Another moment followed, then another. A second voice joined the first, then a third. Their words were not always loud, but they carried a certain weight, a tone that suggested blame, a feeling that something had gone wrong, and somehow it had become his burden to carry. Have you ever noticed how quickly a room can change? One moment there is calm, and the next moment something invisible shifts. Eyes become watchful. Conversations grow careful. And suddenly, you feel as if you are standing in a place where everyone is quietly waiting for something from you. That was the feeling surrounding him now. They spoke as if they already knew the truth, as if the story had already been written somewhere he could not see. And in that story, he had already been given a role. The role of the one who had failed. It is a strange experience when others seem so certain about something inside your own life. They speak with confidence. They repeat their conclusions. They exchange quiet looks with one another, as if the matter has already been settled. And slowly, their certainty begins to press against the silence inside you. At first, he wondered if perhaps they were right. Maybe he had missed something. Maybe he had not seen what they had seen. Maybe somewhere along the way, something truly had gone wrong. The mind can be a quiet place, but on days like this, it becomes crowded. Thoughts arrive one after another. Questions whisper from the corners of the heart. Should he explain? Should he defend himself? Should he speak loudly enough so that the truth could finally be heard? But there was something unusual about the way they waited. They were not simply speaking. They were watching. Their eyes lingered. Their silence between words felt almost deliberate. It was as if they were expecting a certain reaction, perhaps anger, perhaps frustration, perhaps a long explanation filled with restless emotion. And so the day continued like this, one moment leaning heavily on the next. Every small mistake seemed to grow larger than it truly was. Every quiet pause seemed to invite another judgment. Even the air felt heavier than usual, as if the room itself had begun to hold its breath. By midday, the feeling had settled deeply around him. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. There are days when everything moves smoothly, when words are easy and people are gentle. But there are also days when nothing seems to land in the right place. Days when even your calmness appears suspicious to others. This had become one of those days. And still, he remained quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because something inside him had begun to observe. The way they spoke, the way their voices carried certainty without patience. The way they looked toward him again and again, as if waiting for a spark that had not yet appeared. It was as though the day itself had turned into a quiet test. And somewhere beneath the confusion, beneath the growing weight of their expectations, a single question slowly formed within him. The day did not become quieter after that. In fact, the silence around him seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. They continued speaking, sometimes directly, sometimes just near enough for their voices to reach his ears. Their words carried a quiet sharpness, not always angry, but firm, certain, as if the conclusion had already been reached somewhere beyond his presence, and he could feel it, that strange pressure that comes when people believe they already understand you, even when they do not. Inside him, something stirred. At first, it was only a small movement of feeling, a tightening in the chest, a warmth rising slowly behind the ribs, the kind of feeling that asks to be released through words. After all, words are easy when emotions are strong. A defense forms quickly in the mind. Sentences appear, one after another, ready to explain everything, ready to correct every misunderstanding. He could already imagine how it would sound. He would speak clearly, calmly. He would show them where they had been mistaken. Piece by piece, he would return the story to its true shape. And for a moment, that thought felt comforting. But something inside him paused. Have you ever noticed that moment? Just before speaking, that brief space where the mind holds both choices in its hands. To speak or to remain silent. It is a very small moment. Most people pass through it without noticing. The words simply leave the mouth before the silence has time to breathe. But this time, he noticed it. He felt the storm moving inside him. Not loud, not wild, but steady, like distant thunder rolling behind a mountain. There was frustration there, confusion too, and a quiet sadness that came from being seen in a way that did not feel true. To be misunderstood is a strange weight, especially when those who misunderstand you appear so confident. They spoke again, one voice after another, each word leaning slightly against him, like stones placed gently but deliberately upon a table. And still he did not respond. His silence was not empty. It was full of listening. He noticed the tone in their voices, the small pauses between their words, the way they sometimes glanced at him, waiting, almost expecting something. What were they waiting for? Anger? A sharp reply? Perhaps a long defense, filled with restless emotion. It was almost as if they believed the story would not be complete until he reacted. But the reaction never came. Inside him, the storm continued to move. Emotions rose, then settled, then rose again. Like waves touching the edge of a quiet shore, there were moments when the urge to speak returned strongly, A sentence would form in his mind, clear and ready. But before the words could escape, another thought arrived softly beside it. What if speaking now would only feed the noise? What if explanation would not bring understanding, but only invite more judgment? Sometimes people do not listen to hear the truth. Sometimes they listen only to confirm what they have already decided. And somewhere deep within him, he began to sense this. Their certainty had its own rhythm. Their voices moved in a circle that did not seem to leave much space for quiet understanding. Perhaps words would not change that circle. Perhaps words would only spin it faster. So he remained where he was, in that quiet place between feeling and response. It was not easy. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. Many believe that strength must always be loud, always immediate, always ready to defend itself. But the silence he felt now was different. It was watchful. It was patient. And slowly, most unnoticed, something inside him began to shift. The storm did not disappear, but it lost its urgency. The need to prove something began to soften, and in the quiet space left behind, a small realization began to appear. Not everything that is said requires an answer. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected in the same moment it appears. Sometimes silence reveals more than words ever could. And as the day continued around him, with voices rising and falling like distant winds, he began to understand something quietly powerful. They were waiting for a reaction, but perhaps the most unexpected thing he could offer was none at all. As the day continued, something unusual began to happen inside him. The voices around him had not changed. They still carried the same certainty, the same quiet judgment. Now and then, another remark would drift toward him, like a stone lightly tossed into still water. But the water inside him was no longer as restless as before. At first, he had believed the storm would only grow stronger if he remained silent, that the pressure would build until the words forced their way out. Yet the opposite began to unfold. The longer he allowed the silence to remain, the more space appeared within it. And in that space, he started to see things more clearly. He began to notice how quickly people speak when they feel sure of something, how easily conclusions form in the human mind. A few moments, a few observations, and suddenly a full story exists. A story that feels complete. But is it always true? He listened carefully now, not only to the words, but to the spaces between them. Sometimes their voices carried more assumption than understanding. Sometimes their certainty seemed to rest on small pieces of the day, arranged into a shape that only looked like truth. It was not anger he felt while observing this, not envy and resentment. Only a quiet awareness. How often does this happen in the world? A moment is misunderstood, and before patience can arrive, the story grows larger than the moment itself. He could feel their expectations still lingering in the air. From time to time, one of them would pause slightly after speaking, as if leaving room for him to answer. Their eyes would turn toward him for a brief second, and then nothing. Only his calm presence. It was strange how powerful that felt. Not powerful in a loud or dramatic way. There was no triumph in it, no feeling of victory, only a steady calm that seemed to anchor him where he stood. He began to realize something quiet but important. Reaction is often easy. Emotion rises quickly. Words follow, and soon the air becomes filled with noise. Voices grow louder. Explanations multiply, and everyone becomes certain that their version must be heard. But silence. Silence asks for something different. It asks for patience. It asks for trust in something deeper than the moment itself. And as he remained still, he noticed another subtle change. The weight of their words began to feel lighter, not because they had stopped speaking, but because he was no longer carrying every sentence inside his heart. Before, each remark had felt like something that needed to be answered, something that needed correction. Now they passed through his hearing more gently. Some words fell away before they could take root. Others simply remained where they were spoken without traveling further into his thoughts. This was new to him. For many years, he had believed that respect must be defended quickly, that silence would invite more misunderstanding, that dignity required constant explanation. But standing there, inside this quiet space he had chosen, he began to sense another kind of strength, a strength that did not rush forward, a strength that did not argue with every voice, a strength that allowed time to breathe. They continued to speak, though their voices slowly lost the sharp edge they had carried earlier. The rhythm of their certainty seemed less steady now, as if the absence of his reaction had quietly changed something in the air. Perhaps they had expected resistance. Perhaps they had expected anger. But without those things, the story they had been telling seemed to move differently. He watched this gently, without judgment, and somewhere deep inside him, a calm realization settled like evening light across still water. Not every battle deserves your voice. Not every accusation deserves your energy. Sometimes, the strongest place a person can stand is within their own quiet understanding. Because when you stop rushing to prove yourself, something unexpected begins to appear. Clarity, the kind that does not shout, the kind that waits patiently, knowing the truth does not become stronger through noise. It becomes stronger through time and through the quiet dignity of someone who no longer feels the need to fight every shadow that passes by. By the time the day began to soften into evening, the air around him felt different. The voices had grown quieter, not completely silent, but softer now, as though the energy that once pushed them forward had slowly faded. Words still passed between them, but they no longer carried the same sharp certainty they had in the morning. And he remained where he had been all along, calm, still, watching. Something inside him had settled in a way he had never quite felt before. It was not the satisfaction of proving anyone wrong. In fact, no such moment had happened. No dramatic turning point. No loud realization from those around him. The world outside him had changed very little, but the world within him had shifted in a lasting way. He noticed it in the way his breathing felt steady, in the way his thoughts no longer rushed to defend every part of the day. The weight that had pressed so heavily on him earlier now seemed strangely distant, like a storm that had passed across the horizon. Have you ever felt that moment? When something that once seemed overwhelming suddenly loses its power, not because it disappeared, but because you stopped holding it so tightly. He looked around gently, noticing the same faces, the same movements, the same ordinary rhythm of the evening. Nothing extraordinary had happened on the surface, yet something important had taken place within him. Earlier that day, when the first words had been spoken, he had almost stepped into the noise. He had nearly allowed the storm of emotion to guide his voice, to push him into explanations, arguments, and restless defense. It would have been easy, very easy. Most people would have done the same without hesitation, and perhaps no one would have blamed them. But by remaining silent, by allowing the storm to pass through him instead of out of him, he had discovered something he had never truly understood before. Silence is not empty. It holds a quiet form of dignity, not the kind that demands attention, not the kind that tries to control what others think, but the kind that rests peacefully inside a person who knows they do not need to fight every misunderstanding that appears in the world, because misunderstandings come and go like clouds. If a person chases every cloud across the sky, they will spend their entire life running. But if they remain steady, the sky slowly clears on its own. As this thought settled inside him, he realized that the day which had once seemed so heavy had given him an unexpected gift. It had shown him the space between feeling and reaction, a small space often unnoticed. Yet within that space lives a quiet freedom, the freedom to choose calm instead of noise, the freedom to allow time to reveal what words often cannot, and perhaps most importantly, the freedom to protect something very delicate inside the human heart: self-respect. Not the kind that grows louder when challenged, but the kind that grows quieter, steadier, more rooted. He understood now that his silence had never been weakness. It had been a form of care, a way of guarding his own peace from being pulled into a storm that did not truly belong to him. The evening light continued to fade slowly, and with it the memory of the day's tension began to loosen its grip. Tomorrow would come, just as quietly as today had begun. Perhaps people would remember the events of this day differently. Perhaps some would still hold their earlier conclusions. Perhaps others would slowly see things more clearly with time. But none of that disturbed him now, because something inside him had already reached its own understanding. The day everything had seemed to go wrong had quietly taught him where his strength truly lived, not in reaction, not in explanation, but in the calm space where a person chooses silence and allows their dignity to speak for them.